All right, everyone, we're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm joined once again by my colleague, staff writer, Western correspondent at The Federalist, Tristan Justice, who's actually fresh off a reporting trip to California. Tristan, thanks for stopping by.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So Tristan got shipped out to California as our Western correspondent because the situation in California is a very important case study as to how this country handled COVID, how our government handled COVID, how the federal government interacted with state governments in handling COVID. So Tristan, after some time in California digging into all of these details, what do you think is an important takeaway from the case study that is Gavin Newsom's California from 2020 to 2021?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway from the entire trip was that Gavin Newsom is in a lot of trouble. There's a recall movement out there that reached more than 2 million signatures submitted to the state's election officials, and they only needed about less than 1.5 million to force a recall on the ballot. So those signatures right now are going through a process where they're going to be validated, and we'll know pretty soon whether a recall will make the ballot later this year. It probably will, but the biggest takeaway was that this recall really isn't a partisan recall, and that should be the most worrying thing for Gavin Newsom. I talked to Democrats out in California who talked about how his hypocrisy over indoor dining was really what put the recall movement in place and became such a bipartisan effort. And so LA, I spent about 3 days in Los Angeles and surrounding area, and I really just wanted to do a reporting trip on the toll and the devastation of the lockdowns and how illustrative it is of Gavin Newsom's record in California.
Yeah, so tell us about some of the people you talked to. You mentioned you weren't just talking to Republicans or conservatives or typical opponents of Gavin Newsom. Tell us what you heard and who you heard it from.
Yeah, so I spent the 3 days just talking to business owners in the area, but I also went to an area food bank because I wanted to get a better illustration of just how much people are suffering. I went to some of the homeless camps and I talked to some of the people surrounding them, but I wanted to go to a food bank to look at kind of a macro scale of what's going on in the area. And I talked to a director and toured one of the larger food banks in the area. Before the pandemic, they used to service on average 3,900 families per month. They are now servicing 10,000 families per month since the pandemic started. And they said they've really seen a growing need, not just in the number of families that they're serving, but the amount of food they're giving out. Because as children and kids learn from home, their food needs grow. Because what do they do during the day? They eat. Children can't concentrate in school if they're hungry. And so just based on eating habits, they've seen the needs grow. And so the issue in Los Angeles is especially dire. I mean, you walk around LA, there's homeless camps everywhere, which were by no means they were not a unique feature to Los Angeles. I mean, downtown Denver is full of them, but they're growing in Los Angeles, and there's no signs of them abating.
So this is one of the reasons it's important to zoom into California as an example, is because this is a state that has been locked down hard for a very long period of time. It's not, what happened in Florida. This is a state that went in the opposite direction and really doubled down and tripled down on restrictive lockdowns. Can you tell us a little bit about how long California has been locked down and what those lockdown policies have looked like, for, let's say, restaurants and other public venues?
Well, one of the biggest things that was frustrating business owners in California is how inconsistent the lockdowns have been. California was the first state in the country to implement a statewide stay-at-home order, and they're pretty effectively the last state in the country to begin lifting restrictions. And they've had these lockdowns have become sort of routine. These restrictions have been implemented and re-implemented and tightened throughout the last few months, especially as we went into our winter surge, which was the most dire of the entire pandemic. And so a key frustration for business owners is, how do you operate with so much uncertainty moving forward? I talked to one business owner. She went viral last fall when in LA, her outdoor patio was shut down by government officials, but in the same parking lot where government officials said her patio was too dangerous to operate, movie set, preparing to host a huge luncheon. And so, and they had a permit from city officials to do it. And I talked to her out there for a good amount of time. And she said, what's the most frustrating thing is I live with the expectation that I could still be shut down any day now. And California officials really have been offering not very clear guidance as to what is going to push them to shut down. They've been pretty unclear about why they lifted restrictions back in January. I think it was definitely a response to the recall effort picking up steam. And California officials announced they're going to fully reopen in June. But the threshold there, again, is unclear. And so Californians have heard these promises before again and again, we're going to reopen, and then they're shut down. And that's been really frustrating for business owners.
Okay, so it's part of the issue has been a complete lack of clarity as to what the future looks like. Is that correct? That's what you were hearing from people, is that not only are they locked down at the moment or their capacities are limited, but they don't actually have a very clear idea of when that will change?
Absolutely. And the Newsom administration hasn't been very transparent on this. They wouldn't even release the data after they were pushed on it by journalists back in January and December when they first announced they were going to start reopening things. It was, of course, welcome to business owners who had been shut down for weeks and months on end. But state health officials wouldn't even release the data that was driving their decision to reopen. And when they did, the thresholds that they said they made their decision on still would have kept the entire state shut down. And so it's the lack of clarity from state officials giving people any sort of resource to plan moving forward.
Interesting. Okay. And so another question I have is, what relief has the state offered to business owners who they're thrusting into the state of, total fuzziness, right? Like they don't know, as you're saying here, when their business is going to be able to operate at capacity, what that will look like, what the timeline will look like. So in the meantime, has the state offered relief that's meaningful?
Well, they're not giving business owners money, that's for sure. I think the state's really relying on the payment protection program from the federal government. That's the small business program that keeps businesses, gives them 100% forgivable loans if they do a certain number of requirements. And so business owners, businesses are going out left and right. I talked to this business owner in LA. She said, she actually lives with a little bit of survivor's guilt now after her business survived because of an outpouring of donations after she went viral. But many of her friends have gone completely under, and they're just devastated. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. There's not a lot of support coming from the government, and it's provoking a lot of frustration against this governor, which is really driving this recall movement. I was talking to recall campaign organizers who said, a third of all signatures on the petitions for recall came from Democrats and independents. And so the bipartisan nature of this recall really puts Newsom in more trouble than people really realize.
Now, you mentioned earlier that what's fueling the recall has a lot to do with the dining regulations and the dining restrictions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, how searing was that image of Gavin Newsom at French Laundry, despite his own, or in violation of his own regulations? Is that something that really stuck with Californians and is fueling the recall now? Is that emblematic of maybe the frustrations that California voters have?
Yeah, I think if Gavin Newsom hadn't been caught breaking his own rules, he wouldn't be facing as serious a recall as he is today. I think it was such an incriminating photo to come out last fall. And for our viewers who aren't as familiar with this, I'm sure they've probably heard about it. Gavin Newsom in November, just weeks before Thanksgiving, was caught dining indoors maskless at a lobbyist's birthday party, which included, of course, more than 3 households, which was banned at the time, at the French Laundry, a 3-star Michelin restaurant in the heart of Napa Valley's wine country. It's one of the most exclusive restaurants in the entire state. Plates run up to $350 a plate. And Newsom was caught. He actually, I think he lied about it at first. He said, I wasn't indoors, but you can see a chandelier clearly above the table. And so he eventually apologized for it, and he apologized again and again throughout that week. And then days later, he had the audacity to tighten lockdown restrictions even again. So it was really just a gut punch to all of his quite frankly, subjects who are forced to obey these totalitarian edicts, yet the governor doesn't follow them on his own. So Gavin Newsom in that moment really became the mascot of lockdown hypocrisy for the entire country.
So is hypocrisy what's animating people, or is it a combination of the anger at this hypocrisy and also the senselessness of the ongoing policies? I mean, what's the interplay between those two things? Is this very much like a visceral anti-Newsom, he's an elite who's breaking his own rules that he's subjecting the rest of us to, or is it, he's doing that, and at the same time, these policies are ridiculous and suffocating business owners? What's the combination of that? What does it look like in terms of maybe the proportion from what you heard from people you were talking to?
Well, I'd say the hypocrisy trumps ideology when it comes to Gavin Newsom, because you don't win a recall election by purely partisan effort in California. I think the hypocrisy really struck a nerve with so many Californians struggling. Miss Marsden, the business owner I spent hours with one day, she said she was never really involved in politics. She was registered as an independent. She didn't really care to be Republican, didn't care to be Democrat. But she said ever since the lockdowns began, she's been motivated to join the Republican Party. The Republican Party has really become the working class party fighting to reopen the country so people can, so free people in a free society can practice personal responsibility without shutting the entire country down. But as you know, Emily, we have part of this population now that can survive under lockdowns and can do really well under lockdowns and is now obsessed with living life with absolute zero risk. And so they've manipulated government actors to keep the rest of the country shut down for their own benefit. And that's really hurt the working class people. And so I think the hypocrisy became such an outrage that it's pulled such bipartisan support across ideological lines that I think that's really given this recall effort the fuel that it needs to be successful.
Interesting. So the recall effort, tell us a little bit about your reporting on the recall effort as it's sort of growing and gaining momentum pretty quickly. You mentioned just a few moments ago that it's bigger than people realize, or it's more potent than people realize. Why is that? What did you find in California that gives you that impression?
Just the devastation that's faced in California so far. I mean, there's homeless camps everywhere. I was going up to talk to one person in one of the camps. I was just gonna share a cigarette with him to get him to talk to me. And as soon as I approached, I saw him kind of crouch down with someone else. And as soon as I could kind of get a look, I saw a needle going right into his arm. And I think that was just pretty emblematic of how Los Angeles has gone. It used to be this Hollywood star-studded city, but as the service industry struggles, as California struggles, Los Angeles is struggling, and it looks like it's going to take years to get that back. I was talking to one person who manages properties for the homeless in the area who, I talked to him. He sounds like a Democrat. He's sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. He wants people to be wearing masks all the time, and yet he seemed very supportive of the recall effort. He complained. He said, look, these are representatives and they're not even following their own rules that they're subjecting on the rest of us. And that, again, I think just speaks to how much it just struck a chord with so many Californians. And I think Newsom's in big trouble so long as no other Democrats, prominent Democrats, jump into the race to replace him.
You reported just a moment ago that this is coming, a third of the support organizers say is coming from Democrats and independents. Can you tell us who is behind the recall effort? Who are some of the leaders of the movement to recall Gavin Newsom?
Yeah, so there's one organization that's helping spearhead the campaign to recall Newsom called Rescue California. There had been multiple recalls in the past against Gavin Newsom that just hadn't picked up the traction that this one did. In California, it's actually really easy to recall. The threshold is relatively easy to recall officials. They only need, I think it's like a fifth of the last election's turnout to sign petitions to put a recall on the ballot. And so there's actually a lucrative recall industry in California. But this one picked up steam after Gavin Newsom was caught dining indoors. They were able to gather enough petitions, and some of the power players involved includes former San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer, who's announced he's running for governor, and then Congressman Darrell Issa from the San Diego area. He actually helped fund the 2003 California recall against Gray Davis, and he's now being very actively involved in this recall effort too. And so I think we're going to see some more Republicans put their name in the ring. Congressman Issa told me he's not going to be running in this recall election. He's content being in the House, but I think we're going to see a lot more Republicans come out as candidates themselves as we get closer to recall day.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, you mentioned again just a second ago that Gavin Newsom's fate will depend, and the fate of the Republican effort to recall Gavin Newsom, which is supported on a bipartisan basis, will depend on whether another Democrat gets into the race. Tell us a little bit about that possibility and what that kind of race would look like.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand how the recall election itself will actually work. In case your viewers aren't familiar, it's essentially a two-question ballot. You have your first question; it's just an up or down vote on whether Gavin Newsom should stay in office or be kicked out. It's a yes or no. And if he is successfully recalled and a majority of voters vote yes, he should be kicked out, then it goes to a second ballot of picking the replacement. And so if there's a Democrat on the ballot, then that means it's far less, excuse me, if there's no Democrat on the ballot, then it's far more likely that Newsom survives the recall, because if they get rid of Newsom, then the alternative is going to be a Republican governor. And as our viewers probably know, it's very difficult to elect a Republican statewide in California, almost impossible. Trump lost the state by more than like 5 million votes. And so if there is a Democrat on the ballot, though, then I think voters will be less hesitant to get rid of Newsom because there will be another Democrat they can replace him with. And so Democrats, I think, are really spooked on this. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who represents an area in San Francisco, has encouraged Democrats to stay out of the recall effort in terms of running themselves, to keep the party united and to keep Newsom in office. It's going to be an expensive campaign. And so even if Gavin Newsom survives this recall, it's going to cost millions of dollars to keep his job, because California elections are expensive, being the most populous state in the country.
Well, there's now a broader question to ask, actually, about the Democratic Party in California, where we've seen a lot of the excesses of cultural leftism and progressivism play out in a way that looks pretty objectively bad for their mission, right? For their goals. You know, we see, for instance, the implementation of these extremely radical critical race theory curriculums in California schools. We see all of these like excessive lockdown policies that is resulting in a potent recall effort against the Democratic governor. How are Democrats broadly responding? You got into this a little bit with Nancy Pelosi, but do you think this will temper the California Democratic Party and say, listen, we need to pull back and we need to sort of control the more radical elements of the state party, or the more radical players in the state party who are pushing us really far to the left, and establishment Democrats like Nancy Pelosi will clamp down and seize control even more than they already have? Or do you think, there's really no stopping this snowball? It's too far down the hill, and Democrats just really can't put the genie back in the bottle?
I think the snowball is pretty far down the hill. California Democratic Party is pretty emblematic of where the Democratic Party goes in the rest of the country, considering the size of the state, the influence of the state, and really the direction of the Democratic Party has embraced such a progressive agenda that really started in large part in California. And I wonder if the Democratic Party, if Democrats are going to try to take advantage of the recall and replace Newsom with someone even more radical than Newsom. I think that's probably the game plan in New York, when they're Democrats trying to impeach Andrew Cuomo, to possibly replace him with someone even more far left. And so the Democratic Party in California, the California government has already pretty much destroyed the state. It's going in such a bad direction. People are fleeing the state left and right. The economy is struggling. And I don't know if Californians who are moving to other parts of the country have really learned their lessons about Democratic policies. They're at risk of turning red states blue, like Texas. Colorado's already turned blue, and places like Arizona and New Mexico voted for Biden by 10 points. And now their economy stands to be absolutely devastated by Joe Biden's oil and gas moratorium leases that the state relies on. And so I think the Democratic Party, there's no signs that it's going to go closer to the right. I think it's going to go farther and farther to the left until they're already endorsing explicit socialism. So I do think that there is a possible chance that the Democratic Party is going to exploit the recall to crown someone even more far left than Gavin Newsom.
Very interesting. Well, how can Republicans then in California, where they actually are picking up bipartisan support from people like independents and perhaps even Democrats or people who were never really very political to begin with, like the business owner you say you spoke with, how can Republicans capitalize on the moment? Is it a matter of tempering the Republican Party? What do you think? I mean, that's a difficult question, obviously, and there's a lot of variables that go into it. But speaking to people in the state, what do you think the Republican message would successfully be if they're pulling in new coalitions?
Well, I think the Republican Party needs to keep embracing the American worker and being the party of the little guy who's been devastated by these lockdowns, and being the voice of the people who don't have the voice and platform that they need in this moment right now. There's a restaurant in suburban Los Angeles that is still being targeted for political retribution because they refused to lock down months ago for even outdoor dining. They refused to lock down in December when the governor ordered all dining restaurants, whether outdoor or indoor, shut down, and then they refused to comply. Now local officials are targeting the restaurant. They turned off the restaurant's power, and now they're fining the restaurant for power violations after the government itself is why the restaurant doesn't have power. And so there's an ongoing feud there that I think if Republicans just embrace these people who are resisting these lockdowns, I think there's a real opportunity for the first time in more than 15 years to have a Republican governor in the most progressive state in the country.
So does Caitlyn Jenner help or hurt that cause? And I mean, it does sound silly and ridiculous, but it sounded silly and ridiculous when it came to Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so that's Caitlyn Jenner working with serious Republican consultants, already pretty political as a person and has been for a while. So what do you think? I mean, do you think Caitlyn Jenner is somebody that can speak to the working class elements of the Republican Party? Do you think there are so many distractions there? What do you think about that? I mean, it's a big question. I'd love if you have ideas as to other people. I mean, Isa, as you said, ruled it out in a conversation with you. I mean, other people or other messages that you think would be better or worse, or maybe Caitlyn Jenner is the answer here. I'm curious as to, what your experience leads you to believe on that question.
Well, Caitlyn Jenner might be the answer. And I don't know too much about her politics. I know she's conservative. I know she didn't like Hillary Clinton. But I think it's harder to win in California if you run someone like Ron DeSantis or someone who's been more vocally conservative under the Trump era than someone like Caitlyn Jenner, who I think has a more broad appeal to the modern left or even the center left than someone like Ron DeSantis would in that state. And so I wonder if she could be the answer. I don't know too much about her political background. I don't think many Americans do. I think many Americans just see her as a transgender icon who also happens to be conservative. And that could be a really interesting dynamic to play out in a state that at this moment might be craving something else other than that is right for this opportunity.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see how Hollywood reacts to Caitlyn Jenner. I mean, anytime Caitlyn Jenner expresses conservative ideas, there is an immediate backlash from other celebrities. But Caitlyn Jenner is actually fairly conservative, not sort of, obviously milquetoast on some of these cultural issues, but fairly conservative on other issues. And so it would be very interesting to see somebody who was an American hero in the Olympics, has appealed to sort of boomers, try and fit that sort of working class representative, centrist, not an ideologue mold in California. I'm super curious as to how that would play out. A question that goes into that then is something we've tried to dig into many times and in many conversations. It's not something where there's a clear answer, but I'm curious now, after you've spent some time where this is all playing out in a strange little leftist laboratory. The question we've asked many times is, what is the proportion here of Americans who are leaving this pandemic, as we're sort of in the sunset of it, absolutely infuriated and bitter and, totally disillusioned about big government and the excesses of government control over personal lives? And what is the proportion of people who are actually now wanting, as you say, more government control? They want the government to tell them and their neighbors what to do because they don't trust their neighbors, and maybe they don't even trust themselves at this point.
It's exactly what I was about to point out. I think the latter is far scarier. You point out there's a large number of people today who are now disillusioned with the Democratic Party, and the lockdowns that we've been subjected to is really not based on hard science or evidence or things that we know. Instead, it's a lot of just speculation. But I would argue there might be an even greater number of people, at least these types of people are allowed to be more vocal in our modern environment because of I think the Overton window is shifting with the accepted thought. I think there's a lot of people who just want the government to tell them exactly what to do and are disillusioned with people who think the government shouldn't tell them what to do. And maybe it's just that they're more vocal, but I have to wonder if they're the majority in this country by now.
What has your experience been like in Denver throughout the pandemic? We talked about it obviously early, and it was in stark contrast with your experience in Washington, D.C. before you moved out to Colorado, sort of midway through the pandemic. But what have you noticed from people in Colorado? Is it similar to California? Is it different from California? What's it been like out there?
I think my experience in Colorado has just illustrated to me how Americans have just become a lot of sheep, just willing to do whatever they're told by a lot of people in power. I think masks is a perfect example of this. Americans are so willing to go along with wearing even 2 masks. I've seen 2 masks here in Colorado pretty frequently. And they're not even indoors. I've seen people wear 2 masks outside with no one around them. And if you don't, you must want people to die or something. I mean, I've stood on the top of mountains, the safest place you can be in the entire pandemic, the top of a mountain where the wind is gusting at you. And I've seen people wearing a mask, and I've seen people yell at others at the top of mountains to wear a mask. And so it's been startling to me just how willing the American public has been to go along with all of these lockdowns and these lockdown measures that really aren't we really don't know are all that effective because the people who rule our 21st century public square have suppressed debate on these issues.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, to some extent, it's really difficult for us to know exactly how people are reacting to the pandemic because one side of the conversation is really afraid to speak. And maybe half of that side is really excited to speak because it's now the rebellious and bold thing to do. And people should, find as best they can the strength to express their opinions, although it's understandably extremely difficult. If you're somebody who fears retribution, on a professional or a personal level, which is a completely reasonable fear.
And it's very possible.
Right. So to what extent do we actually just not know what people think? I mean, have you seen signs in California? It sounds like you talked to some people in California, and I'm sure you've talked to some people out in Colorado. And I know you've had conversations with, let's say, Representative Ken Buck, who is working really hard to be pretty bold in pushing back on some of this stuff and not take any of the nonsense and not treat it as though it's serious. What sense have you gotten from your reporting? You've been, even in Arizona and election season, you've been all over the country in the last year. What signals have you seen that there is a group of the country that has been, pushed to even be more disillusioned with big government over the course of the pandemic?
Well, the people disillusioned with big government are too intimidated to speak out because we've reached a point in our country where anyone who chooses to go the other way from where anyone who chooses to dissent from this new world order is ostracized as someone who just doesn't care about others and wants people to die. We've completely eroded any sense of personal responsibility in this pandemic to where it's somehow okay to shut down the business down the street. And so your neighbor, because your neighbor somehow can't stay home. I think Americans, we used to take pride in personal responsibility, responsible for our own decisions. And that's not to say that any American who gets sick, it's their fault. I think at this point, with the vaccine being as widespread as it is, I think in a few months, it is probably kind of your fault if you get sick because you didn't get the vaccine. But still, I think we need to reclaim this idea of personal responsibility. And I'm concerned that conservatives are losing on that front, considering just how much of our civil liberties have been eroded in the last 12 months, to where it's somehow righteous to shut down entire communities for the sake of saving people who want to live life without zero risk. Emily, I want to say one of the more depressing things about the pandemic about this is we knew pretty early on that weight was pretty determinative of your outcome with COVID. And we've seen more and more data come out just proving that point. 78% of patients who were hospitalized with COVID were overweight or obese. And a lot of the country didn't really seem to do anything to protect themselves against COVID other than just wait around for the vaccine and demand everybody put a pause on their lives for 12 months. There seemed to be no effort to get outside. We shut down gyms. We didn't seem to care about our health. And we all just binged on carbs, sugar, and Netflix and alcohol and waited for a vaccine to come save us, when we knew that just having good health could protect you from this virus.
You raise an interesting point about personal responsibility and the interplay there between taking steps for your own health. So that's a really interesting point. I think it's a controversial point too on both sides of the aisle. You also dropped the phrase "New World Order," and I don't think you meant to signal that you were sending people into Alex Jones territory. But the sort of like elite order that they're imposing on everybody else, while also making it impossible to have honest conversations about things like weight. I think Jillian Michaels, who was on, actually she was a coach on Biggest Loser, I think, a few months ago, said something about weight. Do you remember? I think you wrote about it. Do you remember what Jillian Michaels said?
Yeah, so she criticized this cultural obsession with Lizzo over her body image. She criticized this idea that someone who's visibly overweight is a somehow perfect picture of health, and she just made that point that we can all celebrate and love our bodies and not body shame, but at the same time we need to be honest about weight and health, because overweight and obesity is one of the biggest problems facing this country. And I think that's got to be one of the biggest wake-up calls from this pandemic, because I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the US death toll would probably be half of what it is today if America was just at a healthy weight. But CDC data shows 42% of the country is classified as obese, and more than half the country is classified as overweight.
It's interesting. You've sort of adopted this as a pet issue because it's very, very obvious. I mean, the ramifications of this are very, very obvious. And when juxtaposed with the way that elites in legacy media like to talk about body image and weight, et cetera, it seems so starkly disappointing. And I have to wonder, or it's just so starkly ridiculous. And I have to wonder, how this is also an example, I'm curious for your thoughts, of the ways in which elites sort of speak about issues as though they're like intellectual playthings, right? Like body image. And then those have very real consequences for the rest of the country. I'm sure if you break it down by education and income level, there's a big difference between the obesity rate, between people who are educated and high income and people who are less educated and lower income. But it seems to be driven by people in legacy media, elites in legacy media, who take somebody like Lizzo and say, you should, this can be healthy. And that has real consequences for society. Am I wrong, or am I going in a bad direction there?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And look, weight is such an emotional issue. And I think so many people on the left who can say they tend, I was talking to Scott Walker about this, who runs YAF. The left tends to talk with emotion, talk from the heart, and convinces a lot of people, but they omit a lot of key issues that leads them in a wrong direction. And we saw this at the beginning of the year. At the height of this pandemic, Emily, Cosmopolitan magazine, which has subscribers, for millions of women, the cover of their magazine featured visibly overweight women with the text, "This is healthy." And I think so many Americans have just struggled so long with their weight, and there seems to be this movement to almost kind of give up on it in a way, and accept the idea that and try to manipulate what we know about health and science excuse me, that there's a dog outside my door in case you hear the banging. I think there's just this growing movement to accept overweight as healthy when we know that it's not.
So, yeah, and that sort of reminds me of the way people talk about illegal immigration as well. And, I've been working on a piece on this for a while. It's kind of hard to put into words, as I imagine a lot of your writing on the obesity crisis is, because there's a certain sensitivity that you need to embrace and express. But at the same time, I mean, we have elites speaking about illegal immigration in a way that clearly incentivizes it. And that incentivization is so bad for desperate people who are fleeing their countries in the most dangerous circumstances, putting their children in the most dangerous circumstances. And we just have media elites kicking back in their, Manhattan lofts and speaking about things in this way, and seem to be totally ignorant of the consequences for people who don't live like them and don't live with the resources that they have.
You're absolutely right. And anyone and the left, what they do all the time, and they do it especially with immigration, is that they vilify their opponents under the moral righteousness of social justice. And so if you're somehow against immigration, they make it about skin color. They say, if you're against immigration, then you must be racist or xenophobic. And kind of looping back to California, that's exactly what Newsom has already done directly against this recall effort. He's vilified the recall effort as somehow motivated by racism. He said something along the lines of people who sign these petitions are just right-wingers who are upset about the, quote, browning of California. Even though the recall effort from my reporting, has very little to do actually with immigration. It has to do with the severity of the lockdowns, the severity of the direction that the state is going. It has to do with even rolling blackouts that took over the state because of an insensitivity to fossil fuels, this push to go green, which has provoked California being forced to rely on energy coming from out of state at times, and even suffering rolling blackouts. And so this recall effort, from my conversations with people, has little to nothing to do with immigration, but the left has capitalized on the issues to vilify opponents as racist. And more damaging is people actually believe this, Emily. I mean, on a personal level, people will truly buy into this idea that anyone who disagrees with them is inherently racist, which is evil. And that is just tearing at the moral fabric of our country. And we're starting to see these divisions play out in really ugly ways that aren't going to get better if the left just keeps using this issue as a bludgeon to attack opponents.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's pretty remarkable how that is downstream of a question of just restrictions, government restrictions, health conditions, pandemic. It's amazing how these identity politics divisions were worsened. I mean, it's not surprising, but it is amazing the effect that a pandemic, which is a health issue, had on, let's say, race relations and the conversation in general about identity and all of the various pains that our country has been caused by this cultural leftism. I mean, I think we could have predicted that at the beginning of the pandemic, but to watch it play out, to watch us be divided further and further along identity politics lines over the course of a health crisis, when so much of this conversation should have been medical and factual, instead of these silly, esoteric conversations about all of these different identities. It's just been hard to watch, and it doesn't seem to be improving.
No, it certainly doesn't, Emily. And the left always vilifies their opponents in the worst possible terms, claiming that if they don't agree with this set of policy proposals or these ideas, then they must not only be racist, but want people to even die. If you somehow don't agree with lockdowns and think people should be able to live their lives freely in a free society and practice personal responsibility, then they must want people to die. I mean, if you read the coverage of when Texas Governor Greg Abbott lifted mask mandates, you almost would have believed that, if you hadn't read the order, that Abbott banned masks across the state. Ron DeSantis, the left calls him Death DeSantis. And so I always hear this on the left, people in Florida and Texas, they don't believe COVID's real. They just want people to die. But most importantly, they say they don't care about other people. I'm sorry. The left just shut down the country for 13, 14 months, devastated millions of people, devastated millions of livelihoods, devastated millions of businesses. But the right doesn't care about other people. And so it's really one of the big ironies of this pandemic. And it's sad that a lot of people in power who dictate public debate and public speech have suppressed a lot of these issues to where the left has capitalized on legacy institutions to make their ideas somehow seem like the only acceptable ideas in a free society, and that's not a free society.
I wrote a piece this week about how media corruption is now a primary issue. It's not a secondary issue, and it probably should have been a primary issue for years. And I think people in our positions have been saying it should, but this is a great reminder of that. And that when everything is filtered through a dirty window, the public is woefully misinformed, and the situation is out of control. And that should be a headline issue. It's a primary issue. It's no longer secondary. And that here's the substance of what happened, and here's how the media covered it. It's now the media covered it, and that is dramatically changing the substance of what happened. Tristan, why don't we wrap up by just you explaining why over the course of the pandemic you have been so desperate to adopt a dog?
Well, I moved to Colorado, not knowing anybody in the middle of this whole thing. And last summer, I mean, I always wanted a dog growing up. I wanted my own dog. In DC, it was just more difficult with my housing situation and whatnot. So I moved out here to Colorado last summer, and it's kind of the Colorado transplant thing to do, right? You get the dog, you get the Subaru. I got the Subaru. It's a great car.
You bought a Subaru?
I did. I got a Subaru Outback. It's all-wheel drive. It was practical, affordable. It was great. But I wanted a dog just because, I mean, I don't know anyone out here. I've met a ton of people now, but I still want a dog. I'm watching a neighbor's dog right now. I'm sure our viewers have been hearing bang on the door outside on the porch trying to get in. I put it in the bedroom, but it was just noise in the bedroom too. So apologies for that. But yeah, I know I always wanted a dog growing up, and I'm 23 and I wanted a dog throughout my 20s, and I'm single, and I think it's just time to get a dog.
Oh my gosh, you're 23. Okay, that's enough of this. All right. No, it's just, I wanted to ask the question because there's something that, some of these like small personal things that I've seen people do over the course of the pandemic have given me, this sort of like hope of normalcy. And that might sound ridiculous, but here in DC, where everybody double masks when they're outside, and gives you a weird look if you don't, I like to hear all of the fun details of people's personal lives outside DC, because, there's also something political about it. Everything is so political now, but just going through the normal steps of moving to a beautiful city away from the hustle and bustle of the Beltway and, adopting a dog, that's just such a nice concept, Tristan.
I'll be spoiling the dog as soon as he gets in. I'm sure everyone can keep hearing him. He's getting angry as he's on the porch. It's a fenced-in porch, so he can't go anywhere. But I'll spoil it.
I guess that's our cue to wrap up. The dog dictates the podcast schedule. Thank you, Tristan, so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you've been listening to another edition of Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. He's Tristan Justice, Western correspondent at The Federalist. You can follow him on Twitter at Justice Tristan. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious